Antifa, the group of anti-fascist emotional college students who have convinced themselves it is necessary to use violence to take down the fascists who apparently lurk behind every bush. And they are sure they are lurking behind every bush because they have no idea what fascism is. When they say fascist, what they actually mean is National Socialist or Nazi, which sort of could be considered a branch of fascism, but really its own separate thing. I don't think a proper understanding of what fascism really is will actually help, because I don't think the accusations are given out of sincerity anyways. I think it's used as an ad hominem. Call someone a name, and then you don't have to worry about what they said. But at the very least, it would be nice if leftists knew what the insult they are using actually means. First, let's point out that Hitler didn't invent fascism. He kind of adopted it, sort of. The first fascist state was Italy under Mussolini. Mussolini was a former Marxist who became disenchanted with Marxism after the First World War when he realized people feel a greater bond and sense of loyalty to their country than they do to their class. He also became convinced that Marxist economic theories don't work. We will get into that in a little bit. Mussolini hated classical liberalism and ultimately ended up hating the Marxists. He thought he was creating a third way. His ideology would be centered completely around the state. The central points of fascism are totalitarianism, nationalism, and militarism. It is explicitly anti-capitalist, anti-classical liberal, and anti-individualist. The following quotes are from Mussolini's The Doctrine of Fascism. Against individualism, the fascist conception is for the state, and it is for the individual insofar as he coincides with the state, which is the conscience and universal will of man in the historical existence. It is opposed to classical liberalism, which arose from the necessity of reacting against absolutism. He also included, fascism reaffirms the state as the true reality of the individual. And if liberty is to be the attribute of the real man, and not of that abstract puppet envisaged by individualist liberalism, fascism is for liberty, and for the only liberty which can be a real thing, the liberty of the state and of the individual within the state. In this sense, fascism is totalitarian, and the fascist state, the synthesis and unity of all values, interprets, develops, and gives strength to the whole life of the people. Outside of the state, there can be neither individuals or groups, political parties, associations, syndicates, classes. Therefore, fascism is opposed to socialism, which confines the movement of history within the class struggle and ignores the unity of classes established in one economic and moral reality in the state. Here are Mussolini, the founder of fascism's views on classical liberalism. Remember, when he says liberal, he is referring to classical liberalism and capitalism. He is referring essentially to what conservatives believe in today. In the fact of liberal doctrine, fascism takes up an attitude of absolute opposition both in the field of politics and in that of economics. The liberal century, after having accumulated an infinity of Gordian knots, tried to untie them by the hecatomb, i.e. mass slaughter of the World War. Now, liberalism is about to close the doors of its deserted temples because the peoples feel that its agnosticism in economics, its indifferentism in politics and in morals, would lead, as they have led the states, to certain ruin. If the 19th century was the century of the individual, liberalism means individualism, it may be expected that this one may be the century of collectivism. The keystone of fascist doctrine is in the conception of the state, of its essence, of its tasks, of its ends. For fascism, the state is an absolute before which individuals and groups are relative. Individuals and groups are thinkable, insofar as they are within the state. These next couple quotes on fascism don't come from Mussolini himself, but instead from The Political Theory of Fascism by a professor of law and a theorist for the Italian National Party, which was a precursor to the Italian Fascist Party. At this juncture, the antithesis between the two theories must appear complete and absolute. Liberalism, democracy, and socialism look upon social groups as aggregates of living individuals. For fascism, they are the recapitulating unity of the indefinite series of generations. For liberalism, the individual is the end and society the means, nor is it conceivable that the individual, considered in the dignity of an ultimate finality, below to mirror instrumentality. For fascism, society is the end, individuals the means, and its whole life consists in using individuals as instruments for its social end. The state therefore guards and protects the welfare and development of individuals not for their exclusive interest, but because of the identity of the needs of individuals with those of society as a whole. The fundamental problem of society in the old doctrines is the question of the rights of individuals. It may be the right to freedom, as the liberals would have it, or the right to the government of the Commonwealth, as the Democrats claimant, or the right to economic justice as the socialists contend. But in every case, it is the right of individuals or groups of individuals, classes. Fascism, on the other hand, faces squarely the problem of the right of the state and of the duty of individuals. Individual rights are only recognized insofar as they are implied in the rights of the state. In this preeminence of duty, we find the highest ethical value of fascism. This next section gets to the issue of whether fascism is capitalist, which Mussolini already very explicitly said it is not. It is completely opposed to fascism, but this part is going to explain how. Fascism does not look upon the doctrine of economic liberty as an absolute dogma. It does not refer economic problems to individual needs, to individual interests, to individual solutions. On the contrary, it considers the economic development, and especially the production of wealth, as in eminently social concern, wealth being force society and essential element of power and prosperity. But Ashes maintains that in the ordinary run of events, economic liberty serves the social purposes best, that it is profitable to interest to individual initiative, the task of economic development both as to production and as to distribution. That in the economic world, individual and ambition is the most effective means for obtaining the best social results with the least effort. Therefore, on the question also of economic liberty, the fascists differ fundamentally from the liberals. The latter seen in liberty a principle, the fascists accepted as a method. By the liberals, freedom is recognized any interest of the citizens. The fascist granted in the interest of society. In other terms, fascists make of the individual an economic instrument for the advancement of society, and instrument which they use so long as it functions, in which they subordinate when no longer serviceable. In this guy, fascism solves the eternal problem of economic freedom and of state interference, considering both as methods which may or may not be employed in accordance with the social needs at the moment. This quote clarifies one of the most important misconceptions about fascist ideology that leftists get absolutely wrong, and it frustrates me to the core. Leftists love to characterize fascism or National Socialism as hyper-capitalist because in some sense these economies did allow for private ownership of the means of production, but that is such a dramatic oversimplification it can lead to the exact opposite conclusions of what these ideologies are really about. First of all, the government can and will seize property at any point if it thinks it is in the best interest of the state. Fascists recognized that capitalist economies were far more productive, and they thought they could harness some of that power for the good of the state. But in every meaningful way, that meant that their economy was not actually capitalist. The idea was to allow for the illusion of private enterprise, but with strict overwatch by the state and an understanding that the state could step in at any moment and seize everything. In the case of Hitler's Germany, what he would do is nationalize industries and then hand them over to members of the Nazi Party who would do the bidding of the party and thus the state. They were in a sense privately owned, but under direct supervision of the state, and the state would intervene at any moment. The goal wasn't competition among privately owned businesses, it was domination by state-backed megacorporations. You can't have capitalism without an absolute right to private property. In addition, there were price controls and central planning. The repeated quotes about being anti-capitalist is not just rhetoric. The central tenets to capitalism are an absolute right to one's own private property and the means of production by individuals, encouraging competition and allowing the free market to dictate prices. It's more anarchic and individualistic, which is exactly what fascists hate. Fascism is the complete opposite of capitalism. In fact, fascism is far closer to Marxism in terms of practice, just not ideology. If any modern American party more closely desires the economic model of the fascists, it is definitely the modern Democratic Party. Tight regulations from the federal government and a government that can seize property and redistribute it at any time for the good of the public is much closer to fascist ideology than letting rich people keep their money. If you want a more thorough breakdown of how the Nazi economy worked, I recommend you check out Tijek. I'll put the links in the description. Some of his definitions are a little goofy, but he does an excellent job of breaking down how the Nazis actually tried to run their economy. And he makes it very obvious that it was the opposite of free market capitalism. Now back to our source, continuing on the same subject. Fascism, therefore, not only rejects the dogma of popular sovereignty and substitute it for that of state sovereignty, but it also proclaimed that the great mass of citizens is not a suitable advocate of social interests, for the reason that the capacity to ignore individual private interests in favor of the higher demands of society and of history is a very rare gift and the privilege of the chosen few. So each of those quotes so far has focused more on the explicitly anti-capitalist, anti-liberal aspect of fascism, which is really the most central focus of fascism. Fascism, first and foremost, is an anti-capitalist, anti-liberal, anti-individualist ideology. It believes the selfishness and competitiveness of the liberal world order before World War I led to the war and all of the suffering and decline that came with it. Fascism desires order, strong government, and economic control. The other mistake that Antifa-type people make is conflating fascism with Hitler's National Socialism. This next quote is going to be vital in understanding the differences between the two because while they end up wanting very similar forms of government, they come to their conclusions from very different angles. It is not the nation that generates the state, as according to the old naturalistic concept which served as the basis of the political theories of the national states of the 19th century. Rather, the nation is created by the state, which gives to the people, conscious of its own moral unity, a will and therefore an effective existence. The state, in fact, as the universal ethical will, is the creator of right. Notice that the state defines what the nation is. It is not that Mussolini and the fascists weren't racist per se, but it was not explicit racism that was actually driving their ideology. Just as FDR and Churchill could be racist, but that wouldn't make them Nazis, Mussolini's fascist ideology was not a race-driven ideology. Fascism, the state declared what it meant to be Italian. The state came first, not the race. I also want to just point out that obviously there are overlapping aspects here. Nationalism existed long before fascism. National pride is an instinct that basically every country in the history of the world experiences. The conflation of patriotism among Republicans and the nationalism of fascists or Nazis, which are in and of themselves very different kinds of nationalism, is so ridiculously absurd. Being patriotic and loving your country is a natural human instinct practiced by every country in the world, except for some reason by the American left. An important distinction could be that nearly all countries and ideologies encourage patriotism. But fascists literally think human beings should primarily find meaning in their life through their patriotism. A classical liberal or conservative wants people to love their country, but mostly love it because it stays out of their life and allows individuals to find meaning in their life through their own personal beliefs and connections. There are obviously other overlaps between classical liberals or conservatives and fascists, like a dislike of unions, a general encouragement of religion, and in the case of many conservatives, a belief that the government needs to take a role in legislating moral issues like drug use or gay marriage. What's stupid is taking one issue where the beliefs are similar and using that to completely conflate two ideas that are so completely opposed to one another. I also want to point out that originally race was not a motivating factor in Italian fascism. It wasn't until 1938 that Mussolini finally started adopting some anti-Jewish policies, largely due to the influence of Hitler. In fact, it was a reversal of policy for Mussolini, who had previously criticized Germany's anti-Semitic policies. Fascism existed independent of Hitler's race-based ideas. Racism is not a central aspect of fascism, it's an add-on. One last thing I want to point out at this point is the absurdity of conflating thinking we should encourage certain behavior privately with being a totalitarian. Obviously, there is a giant difference between a belief that gay marriage is wrong and thinking we need to use the force of government to clean society of homosexuals. Now that we have thoroughly covered fascism, we need to draw out the very clear distinctions between fascism and National Socialism, or being a Nazi, because the two are not the same thing. While National Socialists adopt a lot of the same ideas about government as fascists, Hitler's National Socialism is an ideology entirely driven by racism, really bad science, and really bad fake history, along with complete misreadings of Nietzsche. Most of Hitler's ideas are based completely in fantasy. National Socialism is first and foremost about the purity of the so-called Aryan race, which is not real, and a strong German state is the mechanism by which the German race would reach these aims. These quotes are going to be from Mein Kampf. The stronger must dominate and not blend with the weaker, thus sacrificing his own greatness. Only the born weakly can view this as cruel. But he, after all, is only a weak and limited man. For if this law did not prevail, any conceivable higher development of organic living beings would be unthinkable. The consequence of this racial purity, universally ballad in nature, is not only the sharp outward elimination of the various races, but their uniform character in themselves. That in every mingling of Aryan blood with that of lower peoples, the result was the end of the cultured people. The German inhabitant of the American continent, who has remained racially pure and unmixed, rose to be the master of the continent. He will remain the master as long as he does not fall victim to deep development of the blood. The result of all racial crossing is therefore, in brief, always the following: lowering of the level of the higher race. B. Physical and intellectual regression, and hence to the beginning of a slowly but surely progressing sickness. To bring about such a development is then nothing else but against the will of the eternal Creator, and a sin this act is rewarded. When one man attempts to rebel against the iron logic of nature, becomes into struggle with the principle to which he himself owes his existence as a man. And this attack must lead to his doom. He describes nature's rule as the inner segregation of the species of all living being on this earth, trying to imply that interracial relationships are unnatural, as if race and species are the same thing. He continues, everything we admire on this earth today, science and art, technology and inventions, is only the creative product of a few people, and originally, perhaps of one race. The Arya is not greatest in his mental qualities as such, but the extent of his willingness to put all his abilities in the service of the community. In him, the instinctive self-preservation has reached the noblest form, since he willingly subordinates his own ego to the life of the community and, if the hour demands, even sacrifices it. The mightiest counterpart to the Aryan is represented by the Jew. What people finally has gone through greater upon this one, and nevertheless issued from the mightiest catastrophes of mankind unchanged? What an infinitely tough wheel to live in, preserve the species speaks from these facts. Since the Jew, for reasons which will at once become apparent, was never in possession of a culture of his own, the foundations of his intellectual work were always provided by others. His intellect at all times developed through the cultural world surrounding him. Or if the Jewish people's instinctive self-preservation is not smaller, but larger than that other people's, it is intellectual faculties can easily arouse the impression that they are equal to the intellectual gifts of other races. He lacks completely the most essential requirement for a cultured people, the idealistic attitude. In the Jewish people, the will to self-sacrifice does not go beyond the individual's naked instinct of self-preservation. If the Jews were alone in this world, they would staple and build and offal. They will try to get ahead of one another in Hatfield struggle and exterminate one another. And so far as the absolute absence of all sense of self-sacrifice express itself, and their coward did not turn battle into comedy here too. So it is absolutely wrong to for any ideal sense of sacrifice in the Jews from the fact that they stand together and struggle, or better expressed, and the plundering of their fellow men. Here again, the Jew was led by nothing but the naked egoism of the individual. Notice the hatred for individualism and the emphasis on the need for collectivism. The reason the Jews are supposedly to Hitler inferior is because he sees the Jews as a race of people who look out for their own interests and are ruthless in business instead of sacrificing for the good of the community. His hatred of Jews is linked to his hatred of individualism and capitalism. And the Aryans are supposedly superior not because they are necessarily better at making things, but because they sacrifice their individual well-being for the well-being of the community. In other words, he hates the Jews for being individualistic and loves the Aryans for being collectivist. Hitler also deeply hated the communists. He thought communism was also run by the Jews. He thinks the Jews controlled the capitalist systems, but that by leading the communist movement, they meant to maintain control even after the fall of capitalism. The base root of Hitler's philosophy, how he sees the world, is entirely through the lens of race. His belief in the master race, his hatred of Jews, and his desire to keep his so-called master race pure. Seizing Eastern Europe to secure farmland and natural resources for his German Empire was justified in his eyes because he was cleansing the land of inferior races to make room for his master race. Hitler would also, in a complicated way, sometimes describe himself as saving capitalism. I would argue that he didn't really understand capitalism, or that it was just rhetorical. He recognized that capitalist economies require growth and thus access to new markets. He thought, as the Marxists thought, that capitalism was reaching its peak because there were no new markets to exploit, and therefore capitalism was about to fail. Obviously, he was wrong about that, at least at the time. He would also claim that basically capitalism was broken because it was being controlled by the Jews, who effectively held all the power. In that sense, it was almost as if he had to destroy capitalism to do what some would call saving it. I would argue that it was abundantly clear that Hitler didn't want capitalism in any of its forms, though, and like Mussolini, thought he had created a third way, not capitalist, not Marxist, but fascist. The above quotes highlighting his hatred of individualism should drive that point home, as well as how he actually ran the Nazi economy, allowing private ownership but putting most large corporations under direct control of the party. He ran his economy the way Mussolini described a fascist economy should be run. Notice, though, that someone could be fascist without any of Hitler's crazy beliefs on race. The two ideas are not one and the same. You could say that Hitler was both a fascist and a Nazi. Mussolini would be a fascist, but for completely different motives, and it had nothing to do with Hitler's ideas on race. In summary, fascism is entirely about anti-individualism and power to the state. Race really has nothing to do with fascism. National Socialism is entirely about race. All other beliefs and goals in National Socialism stem from the foundation of believing in racial essentialism. Both hate individualism, individual rights, capitalism, free enterprise, freedom of speech. Both believe in collectivism, extreme regulation of the economy, and seizing property for the common good. Neither fascism nor National Socialism can be accurately described as an extreme version of conservative, classical, liberal, or capitalist ideologies. They are completely separate ideas in direct opposition to everything that conservatives or classical liberals believe. So for all you Antifa members out there who are so intent on calling anything and everything fascist, my one invitation is just to explain in what way. Be specific. Do you mean fascist as in wanting totalitarian control of the economy, suppression of the individual, finding meaning in life primarily through extreme patriotism? Do you just mean generally racist? Those are not the same thing. You can't just waltz through life generally calling everything you don't like fascist. Try and figure out what you even mean by the word fascist before shutting down every meaningful conversation with people you disagree with. And for heaven's sake, try and figure out what you mean before you burn down any more buildings.